I think we're all back. Two more people. While we wait for the other two people to come back, one more. Is there any questions that you guys have about the reading before I go into my notes? Any general questions, any general thoughts or clarifications you would like me to provide?
I guess the only clarification my group was having was your significance of the boomerang effect in colonization, because
Mm-hmm.
I don't really remember him
Talking about.
referencing something similar. I can surmise what that might mean, just given, the text literature, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't remember him like mentioning that or using it as a metaphor. So I'm really not really sure what that question is trying to ask us.
Let me try to locate that. He used it once in the whole essay. Um, let's do the. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Anthony. Page 41. Also, what would help is my glasses. Let me grab them. Um, yeah. So on page 41, in the middle of the page, towards the end of this full paragraph here, he uses that term. I'll read the sentence that he uses it. It is this result, this boomerang effect of colonialization that I want to point out, right? So that's where he uses that terminology. And I think I'm assuming, Daniel, that what you would surmise is probably how he's intending for us to understand the idea of the boomerang effect. Do you want to provide what you think it is, or do you want to wait for after my lecture?
I mean, I could, take a crack at it from what
Yeah,
I.
take a crack at it, man. I'm curious to hear what you think.
Okay. Just the idea of a boomerang effect. The idea of a boomerang is always denoted with reoccurrence, a recurrence interval, or a repetition of something. You send something out, it comes back, right? So that could really, given the text of it, it's the idea in my mind of just these actions just coming back,
Right.
right?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So no, just so it's like the idea of this history is never, it just comes back because it's a fact and it's being repeated constantly. So it's not something new, it's not something that's been changed, it's been going on for 400 years.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And the aftermath of its effect is just constantly coming back.
Yeah.
It's
And yeah, and I think too, Daniel, it's the idea that the colonizers, all the atrocities that they throw at the colonized, those same elements of inhumanity that they're trying to project upon the people they're colonizing are also being reflected back on them, right? So as they're trying to purport the inhumanity of others, they're ensuring their own inhumanity is really the argument that he wants to get at, not only with the boomerang effect of colonialism, but just through his argument within this discourse as a whole. Does that make sense?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, bet. Um, Let me jump into my notes. And if possible, if you guys could turn on your cameras, it really does. You couldn't imagine how much it helps me just kind of process and feel like I'm being connected to you guys. Um, so Amy Cesaire is the author who we read. This is the book that we read from. The title of the book is called Discourse on Colonialism. Just like Edward Glissant, he is a poet. He is a thinker from the island of Martinique. So we have this Caribbean discourse kind of undergirding our conversation. Although we're dealing with the United States constitutions, I want to be able to get us to think about how certain thinkers approach problems, right? And this is a great example of an argumentation, and it's a great example of how to engage in a discourse, which is the title of the book, right? Discourse on Colonialism. So, which makes me think, I had to situate with myself, what is a discourse? How would you define and understand this notion of discourse? And really, it's a written or a verbal debate, right? So there's a debate at play within the pages of these texts. And if you read attentively, you kind of get an understanding of who and what he's debating, right? The book was first published in 1955. It was originally published in French. And then it was republished in 1972 in English. Okay, so just like Glissant, where it was originally written in French due to French colonialism, it had to be translated and reproduced into English. To me, and this is like one of my favorite just argumentative writings, And the way that he opens up the essay is phenomenal to me. I love the start of the essay. He says, a civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems is a stricken civilization. A civilization that uses its principles for trickery and deceit is a dying civilization. The fact that the so-called European civilization, Western civilization, as it has been shaped by 2 centuries of bourgeoisie rule, is incapable of solving the 2 major problems to which its existence has given rise, the problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem, right? So to me, that's just a great way to open up an essay. And he really places on the table the shortcomings of the Western civilization, right? What else? And then on page 33, he says, you know, then I asked the following question. Has colonialization really placed civilization in contact, right? Because he says that some of the supporters of colonization argue that colonization is responsible for bringing bringing societies into civilization, right? The part of the task of colonialization is to civilize the uncivilized and to bring these civilizations into contact. But Cesaire is like, I'm not buying that so much, right? So I would say no to the question that I pose on page 33. Do they really bring them into contact? No. But then he moves on page 35 and he says, we must study how colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, right? So again, that goes back to this notion of the boomerang effect, right? So not only are the victims of colonization being decivilized, right? But more importantly, the actors of colonization are decivilizing themselves as well, right? And then he mentions in another shift on page 36 that talking about Nazism, right? He says that they tolerated Nazism. It was inflicted on them because until then, it had been applied to only non-European people. So Nazism was cool when you were doing those type of things to people in South America and Latin America, right? Nazism was cool when you were doing that to the people of India. Nazism was cool when you did it to the people of Africa. But once it starts to touch European soils, then it becomes problematic. And Cesaire is attentive to that, right? And he's trying to pick up on the contradictions at play within that reality. And then so it poses the question for me, you know, what is Cesaire doing with Hitler? Because from there, he kind of shifts to his conversation around Hitler. I'm going to leave that for our conversation as a whole. And then on page 39, I'll read a little bit of that. At the very bottom of page 39, bottom full paragraph, it starts with, what am I driving at? At this idea that no one colonizes innocently, that no one colonizes with impunity either, that a nation which colonizes, that a civilization which justifies colonization and therefore force is already a sick civilization, a civilization which is morally diseased, which is irresistibly progressing from one consequence to another, one denial to another, calls for its Hitler. I mean, its punishment, right? So again, another scathing critique written, right? And he's just getting at this idea that you can't do the work of colonization and not be brutal, right? You can't do the work of colonization and maintain your innocence, right? If you're doing these things, you're a sick civilization by default, right? To engage in these type of practices and engage in these type of activities, it talks about how much of a sick civilization you are. And what he does at the end calls for its Hitler, comma, I mean its punishment. So within that, to me, he's situating Hitler as a problem for Europe that was a byproduct of Europe, right? Because of as Europe has been doing throughout the world, it's opening the doors for individuals like Hitler to come up within their ranks, within their country and do what he did in Europe, right? Again, this notion of decolonization, dehumanizing, which we read on page 41 with the Boomerang Effect of Colonization. And then I love how he starts to bring this to an end, right? And he talks about the contradictions and again, the debates and the arguments at play, right? And he says, my turn to state an equation. Colonization, I'm sorry, this is on page 42 at the very bottom, the last paragraph, starting with my turn. My turn to say an equation. Colonization equals thingification. So, right, colonization is designed to turn the colonized into things, into commodities, right? Into components for production. So colonization equals thingification. I hear the storm. They talk to me about progress, about achievements, diseases cured, improved standards of living. But I'm talking about societies drained from their essence, cultures trampled underfoot, institutions undermined, lands confiscated, religions smashed, magnificent artistic creations destroyed, extraordinary possibilities wiped out. They throw facts at my head, statistics, mileage of roads, canals, and railroad tracks. I'm talking about thousands of men sacrificed to the Congo Ocean. I'm talking about those who, as I write this, are digging in the harbor of Abidjan by hand. I'm talking about the millions of men torn from their gods, their lands, their habits, their life, from their dance, from their wisdom, right? So think about Glissant in that third abyss, what gets left behind on that boat passage. That's what Cesaire is talking about, right? So I don't want to hear you talk about how I'm bringing civilization by bringing land and railroads and your religion to these people, right? In the process of doing that, thousands of men have been lost in the Congo Ocean, right? There's people engaging in mind labor as we speak, as I write this, right? So as you're talking about these material symbols, I'm talking about the material conditions of the people, right? And if the material symbols don't improve the material conditions, then what are you really doing? You're not bringing civilization, right? You're bringing that sickness that he's referring to in the other components of the essay. So those were my notes for the essay. Is there any questions you want to pose before we jump into Fishbowl? No? Okay. Is there anybody who wants to volunteer for the Fishbowl?
I can.
Okay, we got Brandon. And what was the other one? I'm sorry, I got Brandon. Who else?
Me, Daniel.
Daniel, okay. Daniel, thank you guys. Any one more? If not, I'll call on somebody at random. Okay. Fatima, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Yes.
You are, okay. How many times have you gone already, Fatima?
I've gone one time.
Okay, so this will be it for you for the rest of the semester. Yeah. I think Daniel, this will be your last one too. Brandon, I have them all written down. I'll double check for you, okay?
Yeah, this should be my second one.
Okay, so
this is my first time.
Okay, so this will be Brandon's last one and Daniel's first one, correct?
No. Other way around.
Other way around.
All right, so Daniel's last one, Brandon's first bit. All right, so Daniel and Fatima, you guys are done for the semester. Whoever wants to start, it's on you guys.
I'm happy to go if you guys are fine with it. Yeah, no, like this was a scathing critique on what we define civilization to be. What do we define cultures to be? Because it's they say the entire idea of colonization is a farce. It's thievery at its core. It's capitalism at its finest. Because that's what it really is. It's the idea of stealing. It's the idea of taking things, but with the gaze of no, we're trying to improve things. We're trying to do something. It's the wolf in sheep's clothing, and it's very in my mind. It's slightly comical in just how bad they were like trying to hide it, because they didn't hide it very well. They didn't even really try in my mind. Like it was just they haphazardly did it, and it's things such as very often used the term survival of the fittest, and it's always associated with Darwinism, which is actually incorrect. Darwin never said survival of the fittest. That is a lie. Darwin said survival of the fit. And actually, his writing would indicate contrary to this ideology. The survival of the fittest was actually introduced by, I think his name was Herbert Spencer, a man who was supportive of colonization. So I love the fact that he uses Hitler as like the focal point, because everyone knows the atrocities of Hitler. Everyone's familiar with it. That's the staple point of what it means to be evil, Nazism.
Right.
Like universally on the planet, he is despised, right? So constantly referring back to him and seeing like just the similarities, the imagery of Hitler with all these other atrocities that all these other European people who are less known. These people are less known. They don't have the infamy Hitler does, but you see the similarities. You see the mirror image of what this European colonization did to the entire world. And if you look at it through different areas, different portions of the planet, you can see its effect just in different forms, but it's still the same colonization. You see the English version of colonization in North America, where it was just they brought in their families and slaughtered everything. I want to take it, it's mine, it's not yours. You see Spanish colonization in Latin America, where what they did was they brought in armies, they brought in troops and wiped out colonizations and ended up just stealing and raping. That's why when you look at the modern Latin American, he's a mishmash. He and she is a mishmash of Spanish and European. It's very similar to what happened in North America, but you see slight distinctions. Rather than kill and take, it's more like kill and rape. And then you look at, let's say, like Asian cultures. A lot of what was imposed there was cultural colonization, the idea of our Western culture is better than your Eastern culture, so you need to be more like me. And you see its lasting effects. I was talking to Cecilia about its lasting effects that you can still see in Hong Kong, where there is a portion of the population there who believes that they should still be part of, England and Europe. And then you see its effects in Africa. I think, in my mind, Africa's got it the worst. They completely botched everything. The very idea of how Africa is broken up, the like countries, is not an African thing. It was imposed by European. We're gonna put a border here. We're gonna put a border here. Who cares who's living there? A lot of the conflicts that you see in conflicts within just the African people were created artificially by Europeans because they were like, this is where I'm going to make my line. Who cares who's living there? Deal with it. And it's things like that that are just like, how did you not see it?
Well, one thing I'll say, Daniel, and I'll take us back to the reading that we had on Ngugi, right? And he was talking about the Conference of African Writers of the English Expression. And he says, looking back at my self-serving heights of 1982, right? And I only bring that up to say that for us in 2021, we can look back and say, it's so obvious, right? Because we see the aftermath of how everything played out. But oftentimes, the Europeans were very cunning in the way that they went about setting up these divisions. And I really love the part that you brought up in the sense that the divisions that you see within African people were set up by these European entities, right? And how they would do this, just like Daniel says, they will go into a country, draw a line in the middle of the country, say this half of the country is Eritrean, this half of the country is Ethiopian, right? And then what they'll do is they'll give the Ethiopian side more resources, more power over the Eritrean side, right? So now automatically there's going to be a rift at play, right? If we're at one point we're one people, now some other people come in and you give these other people the wealth, the resource, and make them authority over me, I'm going to feel some kind of way about that, right? And that's how they effectively went through Africa and created these tribal divisions, right? When you talk about the war-torn Africa, what Daniel just articulated is the reason why. And the same things played out to this day, right? You talk about Bloods and Crips, plays out the very same way. It's no different. Thank you, Daniel. Some great points. Brandon or Fatima, whoever would like to go next.
I'll go next. So when I was reading the reading, they talked about how it was either civilization or colonization, but then they talked about how the Europeans, they thought what they were doing was for the good of their nation, right? Their way is the correct way. Any other way is just, not how it's supposed to be. And Daniel said something about them doing, uh, colonization, but doing it like half-heartedly, right? So there's a part in the reading where they talked about like France. They're another colonization country where a head is cut off or an eye is put out in Vietnam. France would just let it slide. A little girl is raped. France will let it slide. Things like this is just what they were doing. They thought they were right, but what was happening over in the place they conquered just was out of control. It was just they seize and they just say it's theirs, and they just let what happens happens. Um, he talked a lot about Hitler for a good portion of the reading. When I was reading it, like it's just Hitler this, Hitler that. I was like, wow, what happened to colonization? And then I would see how Hitler played a big part in showing us that colonization is a bad thing. Colonization is just as evil, compares to almost, being like Hitler. It's just about a lot of bad things happened. And then something about racism as well during colonization, where like Asian people were born to be workers, black people would be tenderers of soil, but white people would be, born to be treated kind with humanity, masters and soldiers type of things, like I said in the reading. Just all colonization countries were white people claiming other countries that weren't, saying that they should be like them, or they were born to be, slaves of us. Just those type of things. Yeah, that's basically what I got.
You brought a really good point, Brandon, and I love the way that you phrased it, because when I first read this, I had the same exact like realization. Like, okay, man, we're reading this. I know this is about colonization. Boom, that's clear. And then all of a sudden, like he just drops Hitler in there, and almost out of nowhere. And at the time that he introduces Hitler, it almost seems out of place. But for you, Brandon, did you find the use of Hitler to be effective in his argument, or was it a distraction?
I thought it was more like enlightenment. Like when people usually think of colonization when they learn about it in like previous grades, like, oh, people come from other countries, they come over, make homes, make new lives for themselves. But in reality, it's just slaughter, rape, a bunch of killing, just savagery and like being barbarians, not really civilized people coming to make new lives for themselves. And then like Hitler comes in, it's like, wow, yeah, killing, you know, getting rid of people that aren't you, right? Like your race is superior than others. Yeah, that's what I got.
So, thank you, Brandon. Fatima?
Yeah. So what I made sense of the reading of this week's reading was that, European colonialism was something fanciful due to the fact that they did kill hundreds of people, took over property that wasn't theirs, or solely just, what was called capitalism. In page 32, the author remarked the colonialists may kill Indochina, torture the Madagascar, imprison in Black Africa, crack down in the West Indies. Henceforth, the colonized know that they have an advantage over them. They do know that their temporary masters are lying. There is simply no legitimate way to pair colonization and civilization, as it differs from subjective views from the victims who were terrorized. And a problem for colonization was, and Hitler was a massive part of a problem for colonization due to the fact that Hitler and the Nazis, what they did in Europe, and it is not a good notion of what colonization should be compared to, and he should not be praised for his actions of chaos. This also reminded me of like Hawaii's, how they were colonized, and they were still trying to wither from the traumatizing events of cultures being overlooked at. And in the last page of the passage 39, it was page 39 mentions, what am I driving at this idea that no one colonizes innocently? What is civilization which justifies colonization? For me, colonization is definitely not something people should be proud of because of the cultures being taken away to inferior. I don't know how to say that word. I'm reading off my journal, sorry.
Good.
Feeling weak to the core, and no one should go through that. And for my contemporary analysis, I wrote that the United States is a country of freedom. Yet when we try to embrace our culture, also known as people of color or culture, society throws the stop signs in our faces. Although we have come a long way, there's also hundreds of new resources for people of color now. We have still yet to see the media appreciate real culture of the world. Despite the Hawaiians being terrorized a long time ago, they have always tried their best to represent the real culture. And now what the media shows only, the famous lei, like the things that go around their neck. For the most part, it's also important to advocate for real research and, keep embracing real cultures, despite of the struggles, people that are being colonized go through.
Thank you, Panama. You gave me a perfect segue because I want to have this conversation with the class based on something that Fatima just said and what Daniel mentioned earlier, in the sense that the United States is a colony, right? And not a lot of people realize that or think about that. So let's talk about that a little bit. Why would I say that United States is a colony? And think about a lot of what Daniel said in his fishbowl presentation. Why is the United States a colony?
It's a country where many people aren't originally here, something like that, right? A lot of people are like foreigners coming over from their original country.
Yeah, absolutely, Brandon. It's called a settler colony. And this is exactly how Daniel described it, right? They came in from Europe, right? And they settled here on this land where there was already indigenous people here. And then they forced the indigenous people either by death, right? Or by assimilation, cultural death, to become American, right? And to perform as Americans do, right? But very much is it a colony, right? Even when you talk about the first original 13 states, they were the 13 colonies, right? So this is very much performed and acts as a colony. The only difference is that this is a colony that stayed and situated itself on this land, right? So if you think about European colonialism, they did most of their dirt abroad. They did it in Africa, they did it in the Caribbean, they did it in India, right? So when they returned home, their land remained intact for the most part, right? It still was a European country. But the way the American colonial project played out, it all happened on this soil. So there was no real home to return to separate themselves from the colonial activity and from the American identity, right? So that's why, and I don't even, I hate to even go there, but it fits, right? And it's in current times. Right. Anyway, the whole Meghan Markle conversation, right? That's why this becomes important. So she is a half Black, half white woman who marries into the royal family of Europe, right? And she comes into the realization that, oh my God, they're racist. I'm like, well, what the fuck do you think was gonna happen? Like, you don't know their history, right? So that's the part of me why I didn't want to get into that conversation, but you see how that still plays out today, right? And what I was attentive to was how Europeans responded to Meghan Markle's claim, right? Anybody familiar with the individual by the name of Piers Morgan? He used to be a CNN personality here in the United States.
Yeah, I know him.
Do you know like what recently happened with Piers Morgan, Cecilia?
Oh yeah, he's in the Good Morning Britain show, right? He'd been criticized Meghan for such a long time. He used to be a friend of her when she first got to UK, right? She hung out a little bit, but then he said that when Meghan met Harry, then she just disconnect him at that moment after all. So He start to criticize her. He think that she's the kind of person use the social ladders to go up, to climb up to the top and just abandon all the old friends. So he started to criticize her since then.
And so what happened recently, I think within the last maybe week or so, right? A lot of the people of culture on the BBC network are beginning to criticize Piers Morgan for his anti-Black sentiments, right? And really start to hold him to the fire for some of the things that he said, not only about Meghan Markle, but Black people by and large. And it got so contentious that Piers Morgan literally walked off the stage, right? And effectively resigned from that show, right?
Well, because he received like 40,000 something complaints, from that show. So, during that show. So I think he has nothing to do. Well, no, he has to resign. I think the production team wants him to apologize at the show next day, but he refused. So he has nothing. So he has to resign at that point, I think.
Right. And I don't bring this up to be like, TMZ Europe. This is not my point of my conversation, but I just want you guys to think about, right, the dissonance within the European psyche in the sense that they don't feel that they're racist, right? So regardless of how much atrocious things Piers Morgan could say, not only about Meghan Markle, but Black people, right? He still doesn't view himself as racist, right? And he'll still talk about how racism plays out in America, but in Europe, it's not like that, right? And
Europe is a very racist region. I was in Sweden with my husband when I was in high school. I was in the private high school in Sweden, and all those people, they are racist. They look at the minorities like less smart, less intelligent, and less efficient. So they actually see the minorities a different way,
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Cecilia. And so think about when we read Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, right? And they talked about in that book how Europe was one of the first countries to take a disavow to the institution of enslavement, right? Because of that, Europe feels as if they absolved their race problem, right? They're not racist because they were one of the first countries to say that racism or slavery is bad, right? So because of them taking that step, they can say that they're not racist like the way that America is racist, right? If you guys want to have a really good read on how European racism plays out, there's an essay by James Baldwin. The name of the essay is Stranger in the Village. If you want to read that and write up a brief journal about that, I'll give you guys extra credit. It's a really, really good essay to understand how European racism plays out. And if you guys want, I could email that to you as well. But I put the name of the essay in the chat. But yeah, man. So this is what Cesaire is doing. This is what he's up to. I want to ask you guys also, what do you guys as a whole, what do you think about this method of writing, right? The discourse, right? Especially in our now, right? The discourse could be something that's very effective. Think about all the things in the past year that you disagreed with, right? Think about how a discourse could be used for you to be able to express your disagreement or your displeasure with some of our government practices, right? So I just want to have a conversation about the method of the essay, the method of a discourse, the method of argumentation, right? How can that be effective? Why is that effective? Why do you guys feel it was effective? Or did you feel that it was not effective? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Another way to think about this is for your first entry on your journal, right? The thesis is the other part of that entry is how does they produce the thesis? That's also situated within what we're discussing now. So I'm curious to hear what you guys thought about the method.
To me, I feel like the thesis of this writing was to open up the eyes of the reader by suggesting that there will always be a winner and there will always be a loser. And we don't really hear the loser side. And I feel like so through this reading, it was in my mind, it was like civilizations will always be born through conquering another one. Yeah, that's just my thoughts.
Yeah. You know, Francisco, I think you're absolutely right in this iteration of the world, right? Like power will not succeed without recognizing a greater force or greater power. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. There's an old African proverb that states, until the lion is able to tell his tale, the stories will always be told by the hunter, right? Because the hunter is the one who wins. So when Victor says there's always a winner and a loser, if the hunter who's the one who's winning, then the hunter is going to be the one who's going to be able to tell those stories. So that's a very good point. Who's familiar with the term a counter argument? Who has not heard a counter argument before? So you're familiar with it, Ashley? Could you kind of explain to the class what a counter argument is?
A counter argument is kind of just like countering like what the argument is like saying. So like if you're saying this, someone can come say like, oh, maybe I don't agree with this or something.
Right.
Or like just give like a different perspective.
Right. Absolutely. And so this essay is it's the personification of a counter argument. This is a whole essay of a counter argument. Think about how many times he uses these European thinkers, right? There's a whole page almost of a quote from a European thinker that he puts in the essay just to argue against what the individual is saying, right? So to me, this is so on page 38, the whole top half of this passage is not Cesaire's writing. This is another European individuals, right? Renan. So at the end of that, he says Hitler, question mark. Rosenberg, question mark. No. Renan, right? So he's saying with this that all as terroristic as this passage sounds, right? You would think it's Hitler, but it's not. Right? You would think maybe it's Rosenberg, but it's not. It's Renan. And the significance of that, this is a European thinker who is not as widely recognized as being a terrorist, right? As well as Hitler is. But if you read it, you would know the difference between the two of them, right? So I bring this up to show you how you could use something that you don't agree with, because clearly Cesaire doesn't agree with what's being written by Renan, right? But he uses it as a point to prove his point, right? To argue against what's being said. And I want to bring that up because, especially as people of culture in these higher education institutions, right? This is something I had to learn myself going through my PhD program. I wasn't really interested in reading about Marx, right? So for those familiar with sociology, you'll know the works of Marx. One thing you'll know about Marx, he came up in a time of Europe where there were no other people but Europeans in Europe, right? So when he produces his analysis of the world, of society, it doesn't account for race, right? So to me, that's a incomprehensive theory, right? Because if you're not accounting for race, then there's a lot of things that you're missing, okay? So as a scholar, I was under the premise, there's no point of me using Marx because he doesn't even talk about race. He doesn't talk about religion. He doesn't really talk about women by and large, right? So he's very limited in his theoretical accessibility. But if you think about the way that Cesaire uses these authors that he disagrees with, right? That makes Marx, for me, accessible in a way that I could use what Marx wrote and write against it to prove my point, right? So I just want you guys not to be, don't put anything off limits for your scholarly research, right? Everything is at your fingertips. Everything is at accessible for you, right? It's what you choose to do with it, right? How can you take Marx and make it Ashley's, right? How can you take Marx and make it Francisco's, etc., right? How do you take these thinkers that you want to engage and make them yours? That's real academic work, right? Even someone who you agree with, right? Even if I wanted to take Cesaire and build on Cesaire, right? But how can I make my voice come through what Cesaire is doing is what becomes important. So there's no term papers due in my class, but I do want to talk about this so that way when you guys go into possibly your other classes, when you go on to the next semester, right, you have somewhat of an understanding on how to produce academic and intellectual work, right? It's really not about copying what they say, right? Because they said that, you know, there's no need for, we're interested in hearing what you say, right? So at best, you'll take what someone else, what another thinker says, so you could add your thoughts to it and make them yours, right? And Cesaire does a phenomenal job of doing that throughout the essay. You can literally just go back and read this essay strictly for the counter argument, right? Just to see how he uses other thinkers to and makes them his own. That alone is something that you could pull from this essay that's phenomenal. I'm curious, other thoughts on the readings, anything at all? Do you guys like it? Do you dislike it? Specifically people who we haven't heard from today. Juan, Jasmine, Yuretsi, Wilmer, Armini. Yuki, we haven't heard from you today.
No questions at the moment.
So what do you think about the reading, Wilmer?
I'm gonna be honest, I read the wrong one. I attended the different lecture, remember, but it kept cutting out and I wasn't able to see. So I read the Marcus Garvey one.
Okay, so we won't do that next week. That'll be when we get back from spring break.
Yeah.
But read this though, because it's a really good reading. Anybody else? Thoughts about the reading? Questions about the reading? Something you disagreed with?
On page 43, I liked how he said they brought railroads and stuff like that, but they took away culture and their beliefs and their gods, because for Mexicans, a lot of Mexicans are, you know, Catholic, you know, and they worship the Virgin Mary a lot. So there's this thing they have once a year around Christmas where they go to different houses and leave a statue of the Virgin Mary at their houses. And, you know, next door, they like to do this one thing where they invite people to dance for her. But the thing is that the dance that those people do are Aztec dance. So I think that's disrespectful because, you know, that dance was just meant for their gods, you know, not the Spanish and the Europeans' belief of the Mary and the, you know, Jesus. So you know, that stood out to me a lot.
I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying, Juan, before I comment. So there's a tradition within the Mexican culture that you'll place a statue of the Virgin Mary in front of the homes. Some people invite others to come and dance for the Virgin Mary, but when they do that dance, is performed as an Aztec dance.
Yeah, it's an Aztec dance. You know, it's like the dance they used to do for. They would dress as as Aztecs, you know, and dance for her. But you know, I feel like, you know, that's disrespectful because that dance was, you know, meant for their gods, you know.
Okay, so yeah, okay, that's what I thought you said. So I'll try to respond to you in this way. Have you heard of Santeria?
No.
Has anybody in the class heard of Santeria? So there's like this tradition in Cuba and parts of Latin America that's called Santeria. It's also would be called like Ifa in Nigeria. It's a spiritual system, or which you may call a religion. So Santeria is very popular in Brazil and in Central and South America. What Santeria is, it's practice of old African traditions, right? But what they did is they morphed it into a blend of Catholicism and the old ancient African tradition, right? So in the African tradition, you may have like Shango, Yemenya, Ogun, Oshun, right? But those deities would transfer into, I believe you have saints in the Catholic religion, correct? So St. Peter, St. Paul, etc. So what they would do is that instead of saying St. Paul, instead of saying Ogun, which is an African deity, they would call him St. Paul, right? Because what happens is in the institution of enslavement, I can't practice my normal religion. So I'm going to disguise my religions in a way that they think I'm practicing their religion, but I'm still able to do my indigenous practices. Y'all with me? Does this make sense? Okay. So when I hear what you're saying, Juan, right? Because like, if you're Catholic, that's cool, but I'm just speaking historically, right? Speaking historically, just like I say Catholic, just like I say Spanish is a colonial language, Catholicism was introduced to the indigenous people through colonialism as well, right? They brought colonialism, they brought Catholicism, and they brought Spanish all on the same boat, right? So when I hear you say that the indigenous dances are disrespect to the Catholic gods, right? What I think about, maybe what they're doing is still trying to honor their indigenous gods while paying reference to gods who they were introduced to through colonialism, right?
Oh no, I was trying to mean it like the other way. I feel like it's disrespect to our ancestors for doing that dance for, you know, the gods that the, you know, Spanish brought in, forced us to learn, you know.
Yeah, no, and that I completely agree with you on, Juan. I'm right there with you. But also, just to problematize that a little bit too, right? We talked about subversion. Did we talk about subversion in this class, or this is my other class? So obviously not. Okay. So subversion is the ability to like outthink, outsmart, and outwit your authority, right? So what you may be witnessing is just an act of subversion that's been passed down from generation to generation. And that's why they still find a way to reconcile the contradiction of their indigenous spiritual traditions and their colonial spiritual traditions. And to me, Juan, that's how I begin to make sense of the Black church, right? Because there was a time for me, I grew up in a Christian household. My parents are both still Christians, right? But when I understood the fact of how African people got introduced into Christianity, I was like, man, no, I can't get with that, right? But as I got older and I started to understand more nuance, I started to see that there's a lot of, and really as I started to understand African spiritual traditions more, I started to see how much of those spiritual traditions are embedded in the church, right? I don't know how many of y'all have been to a Black church, but there's this thing where they'll catch the Holy Ghost, right? And like there's a certain rhythm of the music will start playing, and you'll start to see these old Black women just lose it, right? That's what it looks like to you, like they losing their shit. They start talking in these tongues, they call it speaking in tongues, right? You don't understand what they're saying, right? But as I started to research African spiritual traditions, it's the same thing that takes place when they do these ceremonies, right? It's the same thing that takes place when they do these rituals, right? It have an act of pouring libations. You'll take some water and you'll pour it into a plant, or you'll pour it into the ground, right, where dirt is, and you'll speak the name of the ancestor who you want to be in the presence, right? And that's inviting that ancestor into the space that you're occupying. Sometimes that ancestor will jump into somebody's body, right? That's what happens when you catch the Holy Ghost in church. And only from me understanding the African spiritual science did I be able to understand how Black folks are still doing those things, but they're guising it and they're subverting the authority, and they're doing it in a way that it looks like Christianity, right? So I just say all that to say, right, it's not always so black and white. It's not always but, right? It's not Christianity, it's not indigenous spiritual practices, but not that. It's often and, right? A way to think about your indigenous spiritual practice and involving the colonial traditions. Because after time, that's all you really have access to, right? And it becomes acts of subversion as well. But Juan, that was a very fecund point. And when I say fecund, that just means it's fertile, right? It leaves room for a lot of deeper conversation. Let me hear one more comment and we'll call it a day. So we got Ansley, we got Kevin, we got Yuki, Jasmine, and Yuritsi are the last ones. So let me hear from one of you guys and we'll call it a day.
So basically what I got from the reading was that like it kind of compares everybody within that like colonizers, you know? And it's like, oh, you kind of claim to be holy, do all the like kind of with Christopher Columbus and like all the Spanish conquistadors. Like it's like oh, you claim to come and in peace and do it for goodwill, but you're not doing it for goodwill. You're kind of just doing it for to benefit yourself and to benefit your country. And not only that, but you're taking away lives all while you're doing it. And it's like kind of hypocritical when you say you're doing it for the greater good when it's actually worsening everything around you.
Yeah, it's real talk, man. So to me, the way I thought about it is like, what good is a freeway through East LA if you got to kill a third of the people who live in East LA, right? Because that's the comparison that he draws, right? Well, we gave you these many miles of road, we gave you railroads, right? We brought you these modern things. But Cesaire is like, yo, I'm talking about the 200 million people who are in the Congo Ocean, right? So you can't, again, exchange these material goods for the material well-being of people. It doesn't equate.
Yeah, like another point is kind of like the same thing, but I don't know if any of you guys watched Infinity War or like Keep Up with Thanos and all like the MCU, but kind of reminded me of that where Thanos kind of eliminates like half the universe for the greater good, but then it's like it's just worse. Yeah,
half the people's gone, so greater good. Yeah, absolutely. Let me do this. So I'm going to share a screen real quick so I'll show you guys what's next week's reading is. Bear with me 1 second. And I also think in all reality, I believe I'm going to try to be more consistent about sending the readings out via email on Friday. The only thing is, like, I have seminars on Fridays, and I have like meetings in the morning, and then I have a seminar from 3:30 to 6:30 every Friday. So like by the time I'm done with that, my mind is just not on this. So if somebody could remind me to send that email, I'll be more consistent on sending those out. But for next week's reading, and this will be our last reading before spring break. Go to classwork. We're going to read Frederick Douglass, and I skipped him, so you're going to have to go back to weeks 4 through 7, and it's going to be this one, A Documentary History, and this really gets to the heart of the matter. It's talking about the Constitution, right? Mind you, it says 20 pages on here. It's a little bit longer. It goes a lot faster than what you think, though, because this is actual speech that he's giving. So. It seems long, but it's not as long as you think because it's spoken and it's pretty easy to move through. But just be cognizant of that and give yourself enough time to get through as much of the 20 pages as possible, okay? So that will be our reading for next week. We'll go to spring break. We'll come back from spring break. We'll have our midterm review, and then that following week will be the midterm. So next week's reading, again, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Next week's reading, again, will be Frederick Douglass. It's going to be in weeks 4 through 7, and it's going to be this one on the bottom here. Yeah. So, and then we'll do Marcus Garvey when we are done with our midterm. Okay, are there any questions for me? All right, you guys, have a good week. Be safe, enjoy your weekend, and I will see you next Tuesday. Peace.